Hello, Gene Schwimmer here. Welcome to today's vlog. Before we get into the main subject for today, I just want to discuss another item, a very brief discussion. It's an example of, I was going to say media bias, but well, yeah, it is. It's media bias, but also an example of how much certain segments of the media hate Donald Trump. Here's a headline: CNN poll, Biden tops Trump nationwide, but battlegrounds tilt Trump. Now, to CNN's credit, they reported this story accurately and fairly. It is their own poll. But what is interesting is that I've read several articles on this. I'm not going to put a whole bunch up, but the CNN pundits, the talking heads, have been talking this poll down. Why? Because it shows good news about Donald Trump. They have even gone to the lengths of saying not to put a lot of faith in that poll, even though this is exactly what happened in 2016, the 2016 election, where Trump lost the popular vote but won in the Electoral College. So all this poll is saying is the same thing. It's just saying that what happened in 2016 could happen again, but the CNN talking heads, at least some of them, are saying, don't look, nothing to see here, move on, don't pay attention to that poll. Now on to our main subject. So come with me as we journey to the Middle East, where I want to pick up on a story that I did a few vlogs ago about the tension, or well, the standoff between the Israelis and the Palestinians. I remarked that it was interesting to me and ironic that it is the West that is standing behind the Palestinians and really acting as enablers for their fantasy of dividing the capital of Israel, Jerusalem, and bringing in a lot of fake refugees, what they call the right of return. I'm going to get to that in a minute. But they want to bring in all these, I say fake refugees, because under international law, refugees are people who were physically in a country and then had to leave for whatever reason. It specifically does not include these refugees' descendants. What usually happens, well, what happened to my own people, the Jews, for 2,000 years, we were expelled from a number of countries in Europe, by the way, a number of European countries, and to the credit of the Arab countries at that time, the Muslim countries, they were, for instance, in 1492, when Columbus sailed the ocean blue, Queen Isabella, Spain, expelled all the Jews from Spain, but the Arab countries were willing to take them in. They were happy to take them in. They thought they would be a credit, an addition to the country. Now, just to be fair, Jews were always second-class citizens in these countries. But what I'm getting at is that it's normal in a war to have refugees, and for other reasons too, such as a natural disaster. But what has always happened in the past is that refugees get absorbed into other countries. I just gave the example of the Jews, but other peoples too, other refugees, until the Palestinians, where the Arabs, to keep them as political pawns, have been keeping the Palestinians in camps, most notably Lebanon. Now, what should happen is these refugees and their descendants should be released from these camps. The ones, for instance, in Lebanon, and by the way, in Lebanon, those Palestinians are not allowed to practice certain professions, but I'm getting off the subject there. The main point is that they should become Lebanese citizens, especially those who were actually born in Lebanon, just like here, where somebody born in the United States is a U.S. citizen. That's the way it's supposed to go, but not with the Palestinians. I'm going to eventually get to my main point, the subject of this vlog, is that this whole issue will solve itself in time if we remove this double standard with the Palestinians. But what I want to mention right now is, I said in my earlier vlog, it's interesting, ironic, that the people enabling the Palestinians to continue with their fantasy of flooding Israel with these fake refugees, dividing Jerusalem, taking possession of the Jordan Valley, they're all in the West. It's Europe that's doing it. In the Middle East, you know, I'll just go right to the headline here and give you some quotes. This is what I'm talking about. Ex-Israeli MK, MK is member of the Knesset, that's the Israeli legislature. It's the equivalent of MP in England, member of parliament. The Israeli parliament is called the Knesset. So, ex-Israeli MK on Palestinian refugees. Arab world moving on, but West still indulging return fantasy. So we're specifically going to talk about this so-called right of return to flood Israel with all these fake Palestinian refugees to change the demographics of Israel and make it no longer a Jewish state. That's what this is all about. But again, ex-Israeli MK on Palestinian refugees, Arab world moving on, but West still indulging return fantasy. The greatest tragedy of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict today is that while the Arab world is moving on from the war against the Jewish state, the West is still encouraging Palestinian rejectionism by giving legitimacy to a fictitious, quote, right of return, unquote, that would flood Israel with millions of refugees, a former Knesset member said on Tuesday. Einat Wilf, who, by the way, Einat is a female name, if you don't know Israeli names. Einat Wilf, who with journalist Adi Schwartz, that's a male Israeli name. Einat Wilf, who with journalist Adi Schwartz is co-author of the new book, The War of Return, made the statement during a Zoom event to discuss the book, which holds that the main obstacle to Israeli-Palestinian peace is not land, but rather the Palestinian insistence on a right of return. By the way, as an aside, I haven't read the book. It's a new book. I don't even know if it's even out yet, but I'm thinking of reading it. If I do, maybe I'll do a review. But the substance of the book obviously is summarized in this article. The war, and War of Return obviously is a play on right of return. Getting back to the quotes, the book posits that this, quote, right, unquote, essentially does not exist anywhere in international law and in fact violates international norms regarding the treatment of refugees everywhere else in the world, which is the point that I just made a minute ago. Unfortunately, Wilf said, the Western world, particularly in the form of the Palestinian Refugee Agency, UNRWA, that's United Nations Relief Works Agency, is indulging the fantasy of a return even as the Arab world is hoping to put the issue behind it. And by the way, UNRWA is a separate agency, a separate relief agency specifically set up only for the Palestinians. Other refugees are handled by another agency, United Nations High Command. I forget the entire name. I'll put up a subtitle or something, but the point is that there is a United Nations agency that handles all refugees from all conflicts or from whatever cause, but there is this special one only for Palestinians, and it is the only one that is counting descendants of what we recognize under international law as refugees. I should say as refugees in quotes, because they're not. Back to the quotes. Quote, Much of the tragedy of what's happening at this moment is that you're beginning to hear voices in the Arab world, not among Palestinians, but in the Arab world, Saudi Arabia and the Gulf, who are saying these things, unquote, Wolf said. Quote, who are beginning to say the Palestinians have made a mess of things, they made a mistake, unquote. Quote, the way they're speaking, no Westerner would dare speak, unquote, she asserted. Quote, they're saying very hard truths, that it's over, that it's time to move forward, unquote. Quote, the tragedy is that as the Arab world is slowly moving away from their support for the Palestinian vision that the war of 1948 is not over and could still be undone, we have Western countries giving $1 billion to UNRWA, thereby continuing to fuel the Palestinian vision that the war is still ongoing, that there's still refugees, and that the outcome of 1948 could still be rolled back, unquote, Wilf noted. That is what I was talking about in this earlier vlog where I showed you an article about a Saudi TV show, a series that ran during Ramadan. It was a comedy series, and you had two Arabs speaking about the Palestinians, and one of them saying, I want to do business with Israel. Why not? What is the problem? And explaining that Saudi Arabia, all these Arab countries have done so much to help the Palestinians, and what have they gotten back? They've gotten back the Palestinians, for example, siding with Saddam Hussein when Saddam invaded Kuwait and threatened to invade Saudi Arabia. That's what these two writers are talking about in this book, that the Arab world is perhaps paying lip service to the Palestinians, but otherwise they are moving on. It is Europe that is really the obstacle to peace between Israel and the Palestinians, which involves making the Palestinians understand that they lost, that their fantasy is just that, a fantasy. And that brings us to my final point, which brings me to my final point, which is how to solve at least one of these three issues that the Palestinians are raising, or their demands. Remember that they are, to name all three, divide Jerusalem, flood Israel with all these fake refugees, and take possession of the Jordan Valley. None of those things are going to happen. I do have a way to solve the so-called refugee right of return problem. It's simply to apply international law to the Palestinian refugees and treat them like any other refugees, meaning that only the Palestinians who were physically present in Israel in 1948 when the War of Independence, Israel's War of Independence, began and the refugees became refugees, only those people would be considered refugees, as they should be under international law. If the Europeans would simply do that, then the problem is easily solved. Why? Because, just counting forward from 1948, somebody born on that day, the youngest refugee today, would be over 70 years old, would be 72 years old. So just let these actual refugees, these 72-year-olds and older refugees, Palestinians, back into Israel. There are not that many of them, number one. And number two, we'll just assume, just to be generous, a lifespan of 100 years, maybe there will be one or two Palestinians who will live beyond 100, but not much beyond 100. So Israel can let those refugees, these actual refugees, back into Israel. They can live in Israel for the next 30 years or so, and then they'll die, and then the issue would be solved. But there's also another way it will be solved, again by Europe simply treating these Palestinian refugees as they would under international law any other refugees, which again is not counting their descendants as refugees. So my final point is, so far the Palestinians have shown no inclination to negotiate, but there is a time limit. 30 years at least on the refugee issue, because after that point all of the refugees, the actual refugees under international law, they'll be dead, they'll be gone. So there will be no refugees alive to return to Israel, so that demand becomes meaningless. As long as, and that's going to be interesting. Well, I won't be around 30 years from now, probably. I'm hoping, I'm really going to try. I really want to be immortal. I can't guarantee that I'll be immortal. I can only say so far so good. I'm still alive. I don't know what's going to happen in the next 30 years. I have a pretty good idea. I know the odds are against me, but my point is that it will be very interesting 30 years from now. I won't know, but for those of you who are younger, to see what the Palestinians do in 30 years and what Europe does in 30 years about this refugee issue, when there are no more refugees under international law. So they're going to call all these descendants refugees. Well, I often say in my vlog, stay tuned. You're going to have to stay tuned. If you're a young person, you'll have to stay tuned. And for me, I'm just going to have to wonder, I guess. But I hope I don't have to wonder, whether you'll give me a thumbs up if you like this video, whether you'll share it with anybody you think would also like the video. Got any comments? There's a comment section below the video. You can also put any questions you might have there, suggestions for future topics. You could subscribe. I love getting new subscribers. But finally, most of all, come back and see me again. I look forward to seeing all of you again. And until I do see all of you again, bye.